Hello. How's it
How's it
going,
going?
everybody?
Just hello, stream over.
Yeah, let's
Just
do it
end it.
over. All right, let me end stream, and
Bye
I think
bye.
we're good. Oh, we already have one comment. All right, welcome to Democracy the Dead. If I'm being streamed to Lance's audience, hey, how's it going, guys? And Lance, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for having me.
So you have graciously agreed to do a multi-part series with us, Democracy the Dead, which we really appreciate because this is an incredibly complex issue, lots of conceptual layers. What I'm excited about is that I like when people from like opposite sides of the aisle kind of try to talk about where they're coming from, their perspectives and everything, how they get at the problem and stuff like that. Chris and I are moral realists, and you are not a moral realist, right? Judging by the videos we saw. Now, before we get in, is it too restrictive for us to like maybe get like a position from you? Because we've seen some videos where you kind of take like a, maybe, I don't know if something's changed, but like it's maybe not like a position you can pin down, but you have this method where you can critique other, you critique offers put on the table, I guess you could say, like that. And then it kind of dissolves from there. I'm not, you feel free to describe it how you want, but then you can go on to your moral psychological projects and stuff like that. Is there a position that we could put on you, like quietism or anything like that? Or is that kind of
Sure, there is. I mean, the
Okay.
first thing to say is when your position is, hey, this category of positions are wrong, and the category of positions are all different from one another, the reasons why you might think one position is wrong differs from the reason why you might think another position is wrong. So it's very difficult to define your position in terms of like a position statement on why these positions are wrong, because it's going to be a big conjunction of, well, subtype A is wrong for these reasons, subtype B is wrong for these reasons, subtype C is wrong for these reasons. And then how do you summarize that? So sometimes people will say, I want that elevator pitch, the one sentence summary.
Mhm.
And it's literally impossible when your position is a conjunction of negations of a bunch of other positions. So
Right.
there is that. On the other hand, that doesn't mean I don't actually have positive theses or positions that I take on things. I actually just sort of stubbornly refuse to present them in certain dialectical contexts
Mhm.
as a matter of principle, because one thing I really dislike. So for me, a lot of the way that I approach philosophy isn't with, a paintbrush or some sort of a tool for construction, but a tool for destruction. I approach it with a hammer, with a bulldozer. And a lot of people don't like that. They don't like when your approach to things is tearing everything else down.
Mhm.
But, that's an important part of, growing, forests, if they catch fire, that, it
Yeah.
spreads seeds. And, often you need a bit of destruction for a bit of creation. And so I see that destructive element in philosophy and academia and research more generally as serving a really crucial role in growth. You need to clear out the old to bring in the new. And a lot of times people will approach issues as, well, if you want to critique, it needs to be accompanied by a positive proposal. This is wrong. No, it doesn't. Someone can just be wrong about something, and you could just spend all your time pointing out why they're wrong about it. And that doesn't undermine your view if you don't put forward a positive thesis. Now, it's nice if you do, but you just don't have to. So often I refuse on principle because I dislike that attitude. And the reason I dislike it is because there's something, I think, fallacious or mistaken about discounting a critique if it's not accompanied by a positive proposal. So, like if a food critic says the food here is bad, they don't have to tell you what would be good food to say, this tastes bad.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. And it reminds me of Socrates. I mean, if Socrates is a good philosopher, he would actually like show other people that what they thought they know, what they knew, they didn't in fact know, and he did a service to them just by showing that what they thought they knew they didn't know, without proposing a philosophy of his own. Thrasymachus would get mad at him. Give us your position, Socrates. It's like, no, you know what? And he's not being evasive. He's actually doing a service. So I kind of agree with that. I don't necessarily think you got to put a positive proposal in place of your negative critique. And I like the metaphor of the ice sculptor. The ice sculptor is like shaving away all the all the ice, I guess that's not going to be relevant to the actual beautiful figure in the core of the ice cube that comes out as a result of the negative critique or something like that. Maybe
Yeah.
that's a good way.
I don't think I'm being quite so artistic, when I'm saying all these methods are bad. But I have learned with time that it is important to emphasize what goes right with things. So there's research that I criticize, like in my dissertation, I criticize a lot of research, but it is important not just to appease the sensibilities and soften the blow to the people you're criticizing. Which there's something to be said that's not worth doing. But it's not like just like, hey, let me appease people by saying nice things just to say them. No, it's important to genuinely recognize the value in where things go wrong, what lessons you can learn from the things that go wrong. So, for instance, big focus in the dissertation, I have like a whole chapter on why I think the disagreement paradigm, which we may or may not end up talking about now or at some point. Sure, we will. I think there's big flaws with it, but the idea behind it is an awesome idea. It's a great idea. It's a good, subtle approach to get at things. And I think it just happens to not work. But I do think it pushes research forward. And often good research is built on the basis of previous research that you only see its flaws in hindsight. What's the we stand on the shoulders of giants type thing. We need to appreciate that when we see where people are going wrong, we might not have made any progress at all if we didn't have the benefit of seeing the flaws in what they've constructed. So I do recognize that, and I have made more of an active effort to deliberately point that out. But you did ask that question about a positive use, so I'll say a few things about what those are. So the main positive view, you could call it. I haven't sort of settled on a name for this. I call it something like currently I'm calling it anti-realist quietism, just to make clear that because if I called it metaethical quietism, there are quietists who are also realists, or quietists would say, I reject the realism, anti-realism labels altogether, which I think is maybe the most naturally fitting characterization. But I want to fuse the two, and some people may find that objectionable. I don't care. I get to pick the terms that I want to use. And so anti-realist quietism. And a big part of that is also defined, unfortunately, by negation, but that's not my fault. That's the fault of analytic philosophers. So analytic philosophers have set up the structure of the contemporary analytic metaethical dialectic as you basically have three main categories of anti-realist position. You have error theories, which buy into the semantics of realists and then just say things aren't that way. It's kind of like the atheism of anti-realism. It's, you're offering you claim there's a God, we claim there is no God. It's saying, you claim and people generally claim there are these moral facts. There aren't any. So all the moral claims are false. So that's your error theory. Then you have the non-cognitivist and these days expressivist accounts, which are like, the language just isn't in the business of making these metaphysically robust propositional descriptive claims that refer to these objective moral facts out there in the world.
Right.
So you have that whole category of views. And then you have this third category, which I prefer to call stance-dependent accounts, because it includes both all your standard relativistic accounts and it includes constructivist accounts that make moral claims stance-dependent, and it includes relation-designating accounts, where the moral claims all are true according to a single standard. So the moral claims aren't relativized. They're not true when one person says it, false when another says it. There's actually only one correct standard, but it is dependent on a stance. And that could be something like ideal observer theory, which says that moral facts are facts that a perfectly rational and fully informed agent would endorse. And there you're making the moral truths contingent on the values or preferences of a hypothetical being. And so it's still making them dependent on a stance. It's just a hypothetical stance. So those are the three main categories. But the problem is that they're all structured in this 20th century obsession that analytic philosophers had with the way that you should go about doing metaethics, which starts with an analysis of everyday moral claims, like murder is wrong. You take your prototypical moral claim, murder is wrong, and you say, okay, what do people mean when they make that claim? And the error theorist says they are trying to be a realist. They're speaking like a realist, and it's just, that's not what reality is like. The non-cognitivist says, well, murder is wrong might look like a tempting. It might look like something that's attempting to say
for like a second.
Yeah, I know. I could see them myself, so I'll just restart when that happens.
No problem.
So then the non-cognitivist says, okay, when someone says murder is wrong, they mean to say something like murder boo or don't murder, an imperative, an expressive of an emotion. neo-expressivist accounts are way more sophisticated than that. They have deflationary views of truth and all this other stuff. Not going to get into the gizmos and gadgets of those accounts. I mean, some of them brush up against realism so much it's hard to tell the difference. And you will see articles like in the last 10, 20 years saying, is this even anti-realism anymore? So that's what's happened with expressivist accounts. And then you have the relativist accounts, which are like, well, moral claims are true or false relative to the standards of the speaker or their culture. And the other accounts, they all basically make a claim, here is what moral sentences mean. And my problem with that is that I don't think sentences have meanings. I think people mean things when they express, like sentences are, they don't have any meaning outside of context of usage. A sentence is like a behavior. It's like asking, why does a person walk? What? It depends on what they're trying to do, you know? So the question doesn't make sense because it's decontextualizing an action, and speaking is just as much an action as walking. And so the only way to analyze why a person said a thing is to look at that particular situation. But the way that philosophers in the 20th century wanted to look at, and they still do, analytic philosophers still do this, they analyze these sentences as who is saying the sentence? How are they, what context are they using it in? And the philosophers want to say, no, that's, we're setting aside all that. We're setting aside the pragmatic considerations and the contextual considerations. We want the pure semantics. Well, I don't think there is any such thing as pure semantics. So all of your standard anti-realist positions are based on this semantic pragmatic divide, and I reject that presupposition. And so they're all framed in terms of presuppositions that I reject. I can't endorse any of them. And so the anti-realist quietist view is just that basically the view is the presupposition, structure, and framework in which the contemporary analytic metaethical dialectic of framing the realist anti-realist divide is fundamentally misguided and mistaken. And so one cannot and should not endorse any position within that framework. One should reject the framework in its entirety. That's where you get the quietism from. The discourse is based on false assumptions, or they're not even false in some cases. They're conceptually confused to the point they're not even, I don't even know if they're meaningful. So I reject that. However, at the same time, I also reject the notion that there are stance-independent moral facts, at least ones that are non-trivial. And so I still think that there's a salvageable and meaningful conception of anti-realism that can sort of emerge from the ashes of the quietism. And so hence you get this sort of fusion of anti-realism and quietism. So that's still kind of a negation of a view. So I'll try to say a bit more about what the positive view is. There's a couple components of the positive view. One is folk indeterminacy as a thesis. So that view is the view that I defend in the dissertation, and that is the view that. Well, maybe before I get into that, I said a whole lot there. Should I pause there, or should I get out the positive views?
Is there anything you want to say about the negative part, Chris, at all? I think before we get the positive, maybe we should just get the metaphilosophy stuff out of the way, just so the audience is aware of where we're coming from, maybe, before we get to the positive.
Yeah. I think even the negative versus like the positive kind of contributions. You know, like when some people say that, you're just being negative, you're just being critical, as if it's not actually offering anything to the discussion when it's actually extremely useful. It helps you, even if the criticisms are false, they're still useful, right? Because it helps you sharpen your view and actually be more informed, right? So, I mean, I agree with that. So I don't really have anything to disagree with on that part.
And then on like what I was going to say with what you were saying about anti-realist quietism, this kind of like is a good segue in what I was every single time like I studied like an object level philosophical problem. Not sure how to say that. Like just a normal everyday like free will, like that, like an object level philosophical problem, like with Richard Double. Richard, by the way, for the audience, a book that really influenced me is a book by Richard Double. It's called Metaphilosophy and Free Will, and one of his theses is basically that the reason why the free will debate is intractable and can't go anywhere is because the first level principles that different philosophers are using in their arguments or to support premises in their arguments are tethered or anchored to different latent, competing, non-overlapping metaphilosophical ways of conceiving of what the philosophical project is in the first place. And so because philosophers don't typically do that, they don't have this like long footnote that, oh, by the way, my perspective of getting at all these things is they unpack their whole because metaphilosophy is like really complicated. Not to mention, there's probably some people out there that are metaphilosophical quietists. Even maybe they think that's a waste of time or not worth getting into, or whatever. It might have baggage to it that they might not accept, depending on the quietist, since it's not a unitary position. But it was fascinating to me because, just to kind of like give his perspective real quick, he noted philosophy is conversation. So this is Rorty. He mentions Rorty. He mentions certain maybe pseudonymous authors of Kierkegaard, people that just want to have a conversation, but not necessarily just a conversation, but maybe get philosophy to be in service of some higher goal. So they would say something about Rorty like, they would make philosophy in service of democratic values. Because he already cares about and desires democratic values to be exported to like autocratic societies or something like that. The job of philosophy is to serve this goal of having the necessary conversations that get people to a point where they appreciate the values that a democracy might value, or something like that. Before we came on stream, we were just reading about Dewey. I don't know if you've ever read Dewey. When I first opened a book by Dewey, it was almost opaque to me, completely opaque, because he's coming at these philosophical problems from a completely different metaphilosophy than I would be. It's not trying to solve problems. Bertrand Russell's title, Problems of Philosophy. It's like a set of problems. You're trying to solve these problems. It's basically him trying to make philosophy in the service of the sciences and stuff like that, with some kind of pragmatic aim in mind or something like this. And so like the analytics would look at Dewey like from across a chasm and just be like, we are not understanding this project in the same way. You're doing it wrong. We're doing it right. I don't know what you're doing over there. But and then of course that wouldn't be very open-minded of them to say it like that. But what Duppel did was he said philosophy is conversation. Philosophy as continuous with science was another one. Philosophy as non-continuous with science was another one. Philosophy as underpinnings. So the job of philosophy is to provide conceptual, rational underpinnings for object-level disciplines like biology or chemistry or something like that, like the philosophy of chemistry, philosophy of biology. That's another approach. Another one is philosophy as worldview construction. That's probably the most ambitious view of the autonomy of philosophy. Like there's some metaphilosophies that either don't want to affirm what's called first philosophy, given it some autonomous domain with some kind of autonomous methodology or something like that, and they make it in service to what I said before, the sciences, or make its method overlap with the sciences and give it its own domain. There's another book we were just reading recently by Samuel Alexander, turn of the century British idealist, Space, Time, and Deity. His first paragraph is on this. His first paragraph said, look, I got to tell you what philosophy is. It has the same methodology as science, but it has its own autonomous domain that it studies that the sciences don't get to. It just seems like this is something that we need to be more upfront about, and philosophers need to be more aware of how these background metaphilosophical kind of lenses are almost conceiving of their tools in a certain way, and in such a way that it dovetails on these questions that Duppel brought up. He said, you can get a pretty good idea of what your metaphilosophy is if you can answer what you think it is, what you think philosophy is, what you think it can do. It's another thing he brought up, and what it's for. That's another question. So if you can answer what it's for and what it can do, you can answer what it is. And then what you think it can do is in service to what your desires are for what you want to do philosophy for in the first place. And because he puts emphasis on desires, he thinks that adjudicating between metaphilosophy is an entirely pragmatic, non-rational enterprise. You ultimately choose a metaphilosophy not for rational reasons, but for pragmatic, non-rational reasons. And desires aren't rational. They're just depending on what your desires are. And desires are something that psychologists study, right? So that's going to be interesting to get into. But what I found the most interesting is, as I was meditating on that, it seems like what has to happen on a certain level. I'm not going to be able to exhaust this and solve this right here on a StreamYard thing. I'm not doing that. I'm thinking out loud right now. if I were to deny Double's thesis that it's not completely non-rational or pragmatic, that there can be actual normative reasons for adjudicating between metaphilosophies, I'm already presupposing normativity when I do that. So if I'm trying to stand outside metaphilosophy and I'm trying to prescribe to other people that are populating these different metaphilosophies, like, hey, you can appeal to norms to adjudicate your decision between if you want to stay in that metaphilosophy, if you want to switch from this one to this one, if there's overlapping parts, maybe you can dwell in both at the same time and have your own goals there. But I'm thinking about the debate between moral realists and everyone else, because if at the end of the day we are kind of tethered to a metaphilosophy, how in the world am I able to, or how is the moral realist able to argue for moral realism? How is he supposed to present an argument whose conclusion is, and therefore moral realism is true? How is he able to even do that without already presupposing a metaphilosophy in which moral realism can find a conceptual home or a metaphysical home? So that if these arguments are presented to people in another metaphilosophy, it's almost like it's impossible to even get the argument off the ground, because we're coming at the argument from two different metaphilosophical perspectives. Like the pragmatist is going to like probably giggle at me. I mean, that's not, or like the quietist is going to be like, wait, or Wittgenstein might come along and say, that's not what language is for. You have a completely different criterion of meaning. We're just supposed to set everything before us and describe, instead of explain, or whatever he says. And that's where I'm stuck. Just before we get into the actual meat, it's just when I'm descending down from these metaphilosophical considerations, it seems like my moral realism is justifying my stance that there is norms that may govern the decision between one metaphilosophy and another. And it seems to me, and this might be a failure of my imagination, I'm almost done, I'm sorry, I'm rambling. It seems to me that this can only be the case if God exists. And I'm going to get to that in a second. And the reason why I say that is, as I'm reading your stuff and as I listen to your videos, there's a lot of times where I'm completely agreeing with you, because I have no idea what the moral naturalists and the moral non-naturalists that don't appeal to God are even saying. I almost want to say that they're not even talking about morality. They're talking about smorality. Me and Chris joke around about it. I don't know what these properties are. I don't know what these natural properties are meant to do, what moral authority they have over our lives. So when I'm hearing you like talk to Eric Sampson or other realists, I'm almost like, I totally understand. I don't understand what morality is if morality just is exhausted by an appeal to these properties. Like I don't know what that even means. I can only make sense of it if I take like a Robert Adams type approach, where I postulate God, it's another person, morality, social, and I get it that way. But just for the sake of the overlap, do you kind of see what I'm saying? That I'm kind of sharing your befuddlement with your typical moral realist, because what Chris wants to do too is do a taxonomy. He wants to do a whole revamping of the metaethical taxonomy, because he thinks that a lot of people that are responsible, like we were saying before about how the analytics have defined the game, is they're talking about something that's just not morality. I don't know if you agree with that. I know we're not going to agree about the God part, but just the overlap. Are we kind of saying the same thing a little bit? Maybe
there is some overlap there. There's going to be some places where we depart quite significantly when it comes to the like theism and God stuff. I'm an atheist. I'm pretty critical of religion and of religious takes on things. I don't vocalize or spend a lot of time focusing on that just because it's not a primary interest of mine. Okay. But one of the things I try to emphasize when I talk about this, because I spend a lot of time on like forums and discussions where there's a lot of Christian apologists, is that I get the impression of a couple things. One is that a lot of Christian apologists, at least ones that aren't engaged directly with analytic philosophy, are not aware of the analytic philosophical approach to metaethics, which in some respects I would say is a criticism, but some of them are engaged with it. Some of them are familiar with it. And so you see a lot of these sort of brush fires in these online debates between theistic approaches to realism and secular approaches. And one of the most common things you'll see is this claim, and William Lane Craig and other apologists have probably played a big role in popularizing it. You see this sort of standard Craig version of the moral argument. You see a ton of theists, and I mostly interact with Christians. Of course, there's other theistic communities that talk about this stuff. Will say, like, you can't have realism without God. And to people that have training or grounding in analytic philosophy, that sounds really weird, because pretty much the only type of realist accounts that are discussed in the academic literature in the past 60, 70 years are secular accounts that make no appeal to God. Many of the secular realist accounts put forward by analytic philosophers, the analytic philosophers are themselves Christians. It's just that they frame their discussion of realism without recourse to theology or doctrine or anything like that.
Right. Oh, StreamYard hiccup.
Yeah. So I think Eric Sampson is a Christian. If I recall,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I don't recall. So I believe Terence Cuneo is, and Cuneo is one of the most prominent proponents of realist accounts. So there are probably ways for people that are theists to square the secular basis of non-naturalist moral realism with their theistic views, and that might be perfectly reconcilable. That I don't study the theistic side of things, so I wouldn't know. That would be, and maybe there's just no issue there. But there is something that I get the sense of that's fundamentally different in the way that theists approaching realism approach it compared to secular philosophers.
Yes.
And I think there's something genealogically interesting going on here. And my own suspicions on this are largely Nietzschean. So basically what I think has happened is that contemporary analytic philosophy, so I keep saying analytic philosophy, maybe it's helpful to clarify. So analytic philosophy is a sort of outgrowth of Western philosophy that's distinctive to the Anglophone world, the predominantly English-speaking world. It's largely used in to separate analytic philosophy from continental philosophy. And the divide is largely like the UK, America, Australia, Canada, like the Anglophone. Yeah, basically the Anglophone Western philosophical world there's a different vibe to it than continental Europe, predominantly France and Germany. So you have there's all these sort of sociological divisions that have filtered into these like methodological differences and a difference in the education and training that students receive. And it's all a whole complicated thing. But within that analytic tradition, my suspicion is that basically what has happened is a sort of theological purging took place throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century. And what you have are people that Western philosophers in the Anglophone world, they are absolutely steeped and saturated in Christianity and monotheism and this Manichaean division between the cosmic forces of good and evil that have been absolutely ingrained in our children's stories, our language, our legal system. It's absolutely everywhere. So they are swimming in the waters of Christian influence so thoroughly that I don't think they really are seeing outside of it, or at least not very clearly. And so when they sort of purged their formal philosophical views of their theological trappings and they have their secular realist accounts, they replace God with properties. They replace the theistic foundations with some non-theistic basis. Well, I just think that they're basically, and this is something I've floated around before, but it sounds very critical because I am psychologizing, but a lot of it seems crypto-theistic to me, to just put it bluntly.
I totally
It looks like people, well, that's what it looks like to me. And so I think that there's something to that. And basically, I think that had these same people, or had analytic philosophy emerged, maybe it wouldn't even be analytic philosophy. Had philosophy emerged under different cultural origins, I don't think that you would see philosophers that are just saying, well, I just know there's a good and an evil. Oh, you just know something that happens to be suspiciously like Christian teachings? I mean, but what they might say is they might point to evolution and say, well, we evolved to be this way. I don't think that we did. I think this is something that we learned.
It makes no sense to me. It really doesn't. It's hard for me to understand, to make that intelligible to me. It's hard.
Well, one thing to say about analytic philosophers is just that, and these days, the big irony is that most of them would call themselves naturalists, according to the 2020 Phil Paper survey. I think it's most, it's at least a heck of a lot. They call themselves naturalists. They'll say our philosophy is, maybe it's autonomous, but it's perfectly cordial with the natural sciences. And yet a lot of what they say and do looks to me, I want to say quasi-religious, quasi-mystical, quasi-spiritual, quasi-non-natural, and in some cases explicitly non-natural. And I think that there's a discomfort there. They're trying to square two disparate worldviews at the same time, and I think it's just not working. So, yeah, I have big problems with secular moral realism. I think I basically share your sentiment there. And when you flip over to the theistic view, you see these. Oh, sorry. You see these teleological things, and you see grounding it in the like. Just one point to make about this, and this isn't original with me, is a lot of the way that moral language works is it looks prescriptive.
Yes.
And that's an important element. We're not just saying these are the moral facts. The moral facts for non-naturalists, at least, are supposed to have authority. And the idea of a disembodied...
That's so funny. That's Chris's.
There you go.
I'm actually really close to... I'm actually pretty close to sending a paper in publication on that exact topic.
StreamYard hiccup.
I see them, so no worries. I will pause.
Me and Chris joke around about that. Like, what are they saying? Is there this property that has the Superman outfit on? You better stop it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, what authority does a property have over me?
It has none. It doesn't make sense. So
it doesn't make any sense.
I'm not going to try to just be like buddy up to theistic conceptions, because I'm going to have a different set of issues with those. But the idea that there is an omnipotent, benevolent being that says, hey, do this because I command you to, that at least makes sense to me. Or, hey, I know what's good, and I'm telling you this is the right way to do things. And there's implication. Like, okay,
you're sounding
one
awesome.
thing I would say,
you're amazing.
At least on a theistic view, there are consequences to your actions. If on a secular realist view, let's say you have all the non-naturalist is right, and there's all these objective moral facts, and I just go, I know what they are. You give me the list, right? And I go, I don't care. I'm going to go do something else. What happens? Nothing. There's no implications. The universe isn't going to punish me, so nothing happens. So what use is that? They don't do anything. And this is actually one of my biggest issues with them. It's not simply because sometimes the secular non-naturalist realists will say, okay, but they're still the facts. You're just refusing to comply with them. Refusing to comply as if but by definition, it's bad. Well, I don't care about your definitions. It's just words.
That's the property.
The whole thing is really weird.
Put up your hands.
And you look at the way they describe them too. They're directives. They're instructions, right? Like, they're things are forbidden. Like
deontic logic.
The words that are kind of used to refer to them are like I recognize that non-theists can be more realist. I actually think that they can, and so I'm just like, you can be as crypto-religious as you want. Come on a little closer, right? And I'm not gonna let them do that just as much as they want to. But then I kind of point out these, like, so for example, my argument for the requirement for God for moral authority, if there is such a need for such a thing, is I assume moral realism. So it's just talking to moral realists, right, on their own terms. And then the kind of argument just says, there's authority is either below us, at our level, or above us. And the mountains, trees, rivers don't really have any authority over us. These inanimate objects, even if they're necessary, they're timeless, so abstract objects, they don't really have any authority over us. And funnily enough, most robust realists believe in propositions, like as actually existing things in the world. And these things have a one-to-one correspondence with thoughts, right? It's really kind of eerie. So yeah, so I definitely get that. When the taxonomic problems are pretty big, especially like since I'm a more realist, I have a lot of this psychological kind of reasons to like really want to tighten up the moral realism definition and everything. I put provocative terms in there, like I don't want to admit positions, not people, but positions that I tend to term metaethical weasels, right? So specifically, when I'm talking about that, I'm actually thinking of Parfit and Scanlon and like their views. Like I agree with them up to a point, but then I think moral realism it has to require some kind of metaphysical commitments, and that's part of the cost of being a moral realist. Is you kind of have to have these things that exist, even if they're abstract, there has to be some kind of existing thing out there. And Parfit and Scanlon don't do that. You say these things are true, they have some kind of authority over us, but there's nothing there, right? That has any kind of authority over us at all. So, I mean, we up to that point, I think we can kind of agree, and then of course it diverges. Even you can't even get like so. From your point of view, is even if we get to that point, morals is still false, which is fine. But yeah, it's kind of a step-by-step process. And so I kind of like to, I want to tighten it up, because I mean, if you objective moral facts exist, well, how are you taking the singular terms there? How are you taking the phrases? What theory of reference are you using? All right, so you could just say, well, yeah, I think they exist in the sense that, you say I'm a nominalist when it comes to abstract objects, and I can still talk just fine, right, about mathematical supposed objects. I could say literally true things, even though the reference don't actually refer to anything existing in the world. Say they're a pretense theorist, they could pull that right over to moral realism and say, yeah, I use that in the exact same way. I'm a pretense theorist when it comes to the terms there, the singular terms and simple sentences. And then they just get away with it, right? And that's just inconsistent to me. So I like the consistency at least, right? And then the other point is kind of going too far back. It's just, how do we decide between metaphilosophies? But we can come back to that if we have a flow going here. Don't want to interrupt it.
I mean, I could put a bow on it real quick so we can move on to other issues, maybe.
Yeah, I linked the book. That book actually sounds so cool. I want to go pick it up myself and have a look.
There's really good book reviews on it too. Like, some people are disagreeing with like the hegemony of his thesis. Like, it might not apply in all cases. Like, maybe you can engage in first level philosophical discourse without necessarily always having to bring that in. But it is pretty ubiquitous. It's there a lot, and he pinpoints a lot of like concrete kind of free will discussions that go on, like the famous ones, and he's just like, this is how it's tethered in there. And the only way to, there's overlap too with I don't know if you've read there's a book I always bring up. It's called it's by Michael Ray. It's called Ontological Consequences of Naturalism, A World Without Design. He's got a chapter in there where he introduces this concept called a research program. And these are called maximal sets of methodological dispositions. And these methodological dispositions are dispositions to treat different sources of belief as evidence. You're already disposed to interpret certain data as evidence. And so the presentation of evidence to you to consider to change your research program from one to another, he's using this different from like Kuhn and Lakatos, I think he points that out, is going to be ultimately, if you do see it as evidence, it's already going to be an indication that you've left the research program. You're a part of another research program where you've lost some methodological disposition, gained another one, the one that actually sees that piece of data as evidence. And so you have this like shifting between research programs for pragmatic, again, rational reasons. He brings up another one pragmatic, rational reason is to irritate one's opponents. Which
I
is
think that's a legitimate thing people are actually motivated by.
I know. I've seen that. I've seen it a lot. I've only done it once, though. I'm just kidding. But yeah, so the research program thing, the metaphilosophy thing, I think those are very helpful. And I've noticed it with this with these metaethical discussions, like a pragmatist or a quietist or a naturalist, a non-naturalist, a Christian. This is somebody with a wide methodological net that they're casting on this conceptual data. They're going to interpret it differently. They're going to conceive it differently. They're going to look at it differently. And there's no way really to get to any kind of point. I guess my ultimate point is this might be one of those intractable debates, because it looks like these object level principles do seem to me to be anchored in these wider, higher meta-philosophical kind of considerations that have to be acknowledged because they're kind of implicit in the background. I guess mine would be meta-philosophy is non-continuous with science, I think, or as worldview construction. But it's hard there's a chapter in that book, the Cambridge Companion to Philosophical Methodology, the chapter on pragmatism. He's speculating about this, like, how do you adjudicate metaphilosophical disputes? Do we have to appeal to meta-philosophical principles? Timothy Williamson has a book called The Philosophy of Philosophy. I think he has a certain philosophy that he takes. He prefers to call it philosophy of philosophy and not metaphilosophy or something. Yeah. And he has his own take on it. And it's just like, it's hard to know exactly what to do in that metaphilosophical stratosphere. It's hard to know what to do. But it does seem that according to Chris and I's metaphilosophy, that there is a rational way to adjudicate between the two. And I guess, would you say that there wouldn't be any norms to adjudicate between competing metaphilosophies, if anything,
Right, I would not. So yeah, I am a pragmatist about stuff, about this stuff, and about pretty much everything. So I would say that my foundational metaphilosophy is pragmatism, and that's a matter of what I endorse. But I also suspect, as a matter of descriptive fact, that ultimately, when it comes down to it, and this isn't an endorsement of, it doesn't mean that the person who does this is endorsing pragmatism, but I think ultimately it's a matter of like psychological fact. When people decide between metaphilosophies, they actually are deciding on the basis of what will be conducive to their goals and values. So I actually think people, in a certain sense, are like descriptively pragmatists in many contexts. Ultimately, I think that our goals and interests are in the driver's seat, and that the truth at best on certain construals of truth sort of comes along for the ride. But on a pragmatic view of truth, truth is actually a product of those practices. It's not preceding them, it's following them. And I think reorienting things in that way actually does solve the intractability questions. What it solves is the intractability question of which metaphilosophical approach is correct. And the answer is, it depends. There isn't a single necessary, absolute, correct metaphilosophy. Different metaphilosophies will serve different pragmatic ends given the worldview, perspective, goals, interests, values, attitudes, and approach, and particular experiences of every particular individual. And so ultimately you get something that is, you could say, sort of fundamentally perspectival. And that is the approach that I take to these things. But that doesn't, in saying that there's no correct or objective fact of the matter about the correct metaphilosophy, that doesn't mean that we can't make headway, we can't make progress, we can't sit down. So one of the problems I think people see, and this is something that I'm coming around to, and I've been saying this a bit more, is that, and my inspiration for this largely came from people critiquing subjectivist and relativist metaethical views and saying they can't account for disagreement. And I think that that's complete nonsense. I actually think that they make perfect sense of a disagreement. People disagree all the time, not about what's true, but about what to do. And a lot of disagreements aren't, hey, X is true. No, X is not true. It's, hey, I want this. And then the other person says, well, I don't want you to have it. I want this other thing. Or, hey, I want you to give me this. And the other person says, I don't want to give it to you. Unless you do such and such, you give me. So, when people are trading or negotiating or haggling or engage in diplomacy, there are disagreements there, but they are not disagreements about what's true. People can disagree. People can agree perfectly on what the facts are. Someone could say, I know that you conquered this territory, but I want it back. And so people are agreeing on the facts. They just have different goals, and the goals come into conflict. And if you reorient your perspective on, hey, we all have our competing goals and interests, and we can agree on what those are. It'd be really weird to say, and this is where I'm fine with saying, look, you could tamp down the need for heavy duty philosophy, at least for a little bit. If I say my goal is such and such, and it's a pretty straightforward goal, it'd be a little weird to say, but is it really your goal? How do I know that you even have a mind? You can suspend the philosophy long enough to recognize when someone else wants something different than you. And you can then have a discussion. Okay, you want that. I want this other thing. What can we do to get the things that we want together? And so there is, at that point, a question of, it's not a question of, I think, discovering what's true. It's a matter of negotiation. It's okay. Well, if the person the person could just be a violent, one of the questions you have for realists is like, what if aliens show up and they're like, we just want to conquer and destroy all earthlings and eat them all? And you're like, okay, but that's objectively wrong. And they say, we don't care. At a certain point, you don't try to convince them what's true. You try to stop them. And human social interaction is like that too. And so if you want to work with someone and you have conflicting projects, and they just are like, I don't want to work with you. Too bad. There's not a discussion to have anymore. The person is defecting from the cooperation. But if the person wants to cooperate, now you can work with them. And in that sense, I think that competing metaphilosophical projects are tractable in the sense that if we have a bunch of different goals, and it's not like our goals are radically at odds with one another. I doubt either of your objectives are so fundamentally at odds with my objectives that we literally couldn't find any common ground. I think, in other words, you don't have to have two perfectly ratcheted into one another meta philosophies in order for two people with different meta philosophies to build, I guess you could say, meta philosophical bridges between them to get like we're like 3 orders of remove from doing object level
I think
philosophy.
it would end at some point, though, just to be.
I think it would end maybe there, which is just like you have your goals, I have my goals. We have agreed we want to cooperate on trying to achieve our respective goals. Now let's sit down at the negotiating table, and what you achieve on that table can be something productive. So I do think a pragmatic orientation, maybe in a weird and self-referential way, is at least a pragmatically useful way to approach the question.
Oh yeah. I agree. And then the last thing I'll say on this, Chris, and we'll steer to where you want to go after this. I do feel my metaphilosophical corner bumping into what you're saying a little bit, because I would agree that we could probably share goals and desires on certain concrete actions that we care about or something like that. But one of the goals that I can make sense of and that I would like to see implemented is this goal of putting on the table an argument for moral realism. That's one of the goals that I have, and that goal is going to be intractable. I feel like if you're in another meta philosophy, that's going to be desire or a goal that not you necessarily can't have, but you can't have while in the meta philosophy, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like you can't be in the pool and not be wet at the same time. Like if you're in the pool, you're going to be wet. So as long as and that on that meta ethical plane of dialectic, I guess that part seems to have some kind of an ineradicable, intractable part to it. Like the disagreement's going to be persistent and it's going to go on forever because it just doesn't seem like a principle, the plausibility of a principle can even get off the ground to support a premise and an argument with a conclusion that therefore moral realism is true for someone in a different meta philosophy. But we can overlap on other goals and stuff to make society better and all that stuff, and to keep the girl over there from getting jumped behind the dumpster. We can help her out. We can care about the girl and all that stuff. But yeah, so I think that's pretty much the larger point that I was bringing in, the relevance of meta philosophy on the meta ethical level. Because I guess the next question, just a segue. Do you want to reduce metaethics to psychology or eliminate metaethics in place of psychology? Or am I off the scent?
I wouldn't say either of those. So my approach would be heavily psychology based, but it's not just psychology unless we have a very broad conception of psychology. I guess I would say it's more like natural sciences more broadly, but it's going to largely be.
Oh, that's right. I meant to ask you that. That's right. You don't like the way psychology's going right. I was reading some of your blogs, and it doesn't seem like you like these psychology articles that are being published. Like there's replication.
Oh my God, that's like a whole. We could talk for hours about that. So the current issue. Are you familiar with the replication crisis in psychology?
Yeah. Well, I was just saying that makes sense that you just said about the natural sciences. Like you want psychology to kind of be continuous with those.
Sure. But it's not just psychology. It's also when it comes to psychologists, like social psychologists, there's a massive focus on quantitative research, and I don't think that quantitative research is the right place for much of the hypotheses that we might want to explore and the behavioral sciences we want to pursue. In many cases, so let me step back a little bit. With the natural sciences, take astronomy, geology, physics. In a lot of these cases, the natural sciences emerged from people spending decades, sometimes centuries, building up a massive body of observational data. No one just threw up, at least in a way that was defensible, theories about how the planets, which planets orbit what, or basically models of the solar system, without doing absolutely ridiculous amount of observational research, looking in telescopes night after night after night, stacks of pages of observations and data. So the hard sciences emerged with an extraordinary appreciation for observation and qualitative research. Note that, I mean, there are quantities in noting the exact positions of stars and planets and celestial bodies that you're observing through a telescope, but a lot of it is qualitative research. Hey, it looks like this, or hey, it looked like that thing happened. That's not a quantity. There's a lot of qualitative and observational research. You build that up, and when you have a big body of that, a bunch of people look at that and they sort of they grok the whole thing. They have a gestalt of like what all is going on, and theories emerge from that. You take those theories and you go test them. So you start with one type of data and you move into the other type of data. But a lot of contemporary psychology isn't like that. They saw the success of the sciences and were like, let's jump right into the deep end and run a bunch of experiments. So you run an experiment, you test the hypothesis, you have a theory. You run another experiment, you get a different set of results, you have another theory. And then you just have this multiplicity of theories that are all this just ad hoc nonsense that's none of it is strung together in a meaningful way, and it's completely useless. And so, you know, I didn't notice this. I was convinced of this from reading the work. Paul Rosen has this fantastic paper back from 25 years ago talking about the history of psychology and how it emerged and how this is part of what has gone on. And so that's a big problem with psychology. But I wasn't really in this particular context because psychology has that issue. It also has the issue of a really bad incentive system, this over-reliance on sloppy methodology, which has resulted in p-hacking. There's all these incentive issues, but they're replete they're everywhere in the sciences of people fabricating data, people fabricating images. This is it's in medicine, it's in a lot of fields. But what I was just pointing to is there are fields of the study of humanity that are not stuck in this particular focus. Anthropology, sociology, there's also behavioral neuroscience. Like all of these fields are ultimately interconnected to and looking at humans at different levels of abstraction and detail. And they all need, I think, to work together. And there are fields that try to bring these disparate areas together. But I do think psychology needs to be a lot more, among other things, cross-cultural. So a lot of it focuses too much on college students in the US. And good cross-cultural psychology has a pretty healthy splash, to say the least, of anthropological concerns there. You cannot just jump into to another culture or translate a survey into another language and expect it to just work that easily. It requires a degree of appreciation for how different people can be. But I think a lot of times psychologists are too insensitive to that. So really, I think it needs to be like broadly behavioral sciences. But that doesn't mean that there isn't non-behavioral sciencey philosophical stuff to do. So I don't want to eliminate philosophical metaethics.
Dang it.
I don't want it to be totally consumed by the behavioral sciences. I think a big part of it is behavioral sciences, but there's a big part for other approaches and ways of addressing things as well. But that whole thing, what I think it needs to be grounded in is more accurate conceptions of language and cognition. Like what is language? How does it work? How does it develop? What are its features and characteristics? It needs a better grounding in language. It needs a better grounding in human cognition, better grounding in the role evolution plays or doesn't play, and the role that cultural evolution plays and doesn't play. It needs all of those elements. But a big part for me, and this is where the positive theses come in, is appreciating that when you start looking at what I think the more accurate conceptions of language are, you can start to see that, and people should have seen this from the outset, I think, is that morality's primary role is social. And so we should expect the language and reasoning behind it to serve social roles. And yet philosophers have come in and over-intellectualized morality and treated it like this ossified mathematical construct that one studies.
That's the analytic legacy,
Yeah, and it's an awful approach because that's not what morality is for. Look, I'll just say where I come down on this. I'm a big fan of Sperber and Mercier's argumentative theory of reasoning. What they argue is that a great deal of human reasoning evolved, like natural selection favored the development of reasoning processes, not simply for optimizing for true beliefs, but for persuading other people and winning arguments. Why? Well, from a perspective of evolution, having true beliefs in a social context first of all, that might not even make sense. They don't say that, but I would say that. But what really matters is that whatever you say and do in a conversational context when you're arguing with people leads to greater reproductive fitness. And so convincing people to do what you want, it can enhance your reproductive fitness. It doesn't have to be true. From that perspective, you could then see how a lot of human cognition could be oriented around reasoning in ways that's for getting your way, not for saying what's true. And so when you look at a lot of these, quote unquote, cognitive biases like motivated reasoning, focusing more on stuff that supports your point of view. Oh, look, the error you're making. Yeah. Well, what if it's not an error? What if it's actually functional, but it's functional for the goal of convincing people? And so I see morality largely as serving the socio-functional role of navigating local status hierarchies, of facilitating our social objectives. And so when people are arguing about moral issues, look at how people actually argue about moral issues. They try to cast anybody that disagrees with them as stupid or evil or bad people that you shouldn't like. It's super rhetorical. It's often really aggressive.
A big part of the with you too,
a big part of the goal is to basically condemn other people who. It's basically like, if you really want to sum it up, a big part of morality is winning and making sure people you don't like lose. That is what I think a big part of it comes down to. Signaling is a big part of it. A big part of morality is about broadcasting how great you are and showing how much people you don't like are terrible people. And I don't think that is some artifact and really it's about saying what's true. I think that is part and parcel of what it actually is functionally. And when you peel back all the intellectual nonsense that philosophers have, basically what psychologists have done is imported all the philosophy into their approach to moral psychology and just fundamentally misunderstood what moral psychology is for and what it's about. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't these higher order principles. Like it's not like we're just stuck being like dumb argumentative animals that reason like lawyers and not philosophers. And the only thing we're stuck doing is like, in other words, if you describe the function of some process and say, hey, it does this, it's actually for winning arguments. It's not like you have to look at that and go, well, I guess we're stuck arguing. You could stop and go, that's unfortunate that human brains work that way. Let's step back from that and try to construct principles that rise above that. I think humans have the ability, the extraordinary ability, to rebel against a lot of our impulses and drives. And that's a good thing, but that's a constructive process, not a process of discovery.
Well, thanks for that, Lance. There's a lot there. I want to explore a lot of that. But before we do, I want to know, because I put the bow on the meta-philosophy stuff. We can put that to the side for now. Did you want to take this in a particular normative direction, make it more about moral realism? Maybe we can see exactly how we're. Chris, I'm sorry. Do you want to bring up some things with what we were talking about with moral realism more specifically, instead of let's descend down from the metaphilosophical stratosphere and get to the earth? Talk about actual metaethics.
Either one's fine. I mean, I'm fine with the metaphilosophical stuff. I'm probably most interested in like the moral psychology stuff, so just kind of put context on it. When I was doing my research and for the master's and everything, I was into the metaethics, but then I was just getting into the moral psychology. And the most I've done with that is Eric Willenberg came up with an argument called the psychopathy objection against divine command theory. And then the paper I published was against that. And so I delved into abnormal psychology specifically. And that's about as far as I got into it. And the question was whether low functioning psychopaths do have more obligations as the moral realist understands it. Right. And then so there was kind of back and forth on that. But that's about kind of as far as I got into it. So I was trying to decide, well, what is the most interesting stuff in, like, because I read about the first 2 chapters of the dissertation. And so I have not gotten into like the majority of any of it. And so I'm trying to think of anything in the first 2 chapters or the rest of the dissertation, rather than just going through the entire thing, that I'd be interested in. I'm kind of interested in virtually all of it. So I'm not exactly sure what direction we want to go. Maybe something within moral psychology would be fine, or we can stick with metaphilosophy. Either one.
Okay with that, but did you want to talk about like the normative entanglement stuff or the indeterminacy thesis or anything like that? Because I remember personally reading that and disagreeing.
Well, no. So the normative entanglement. The normative entanglement point, like there's a lot to make that. I think the point of it was just stop confusing people's normative attitudes with meta-ethical stances that they have or commitments that they supposedly have.
Yes.
And just saying instead, they have normative attitudes. Let's say, just say they're anti-realists. They don't think right. They don't think there are any normative truths, but they have normative attitudes. So that doesn't mean they're a bad person, right? Like that.
Right.
That doesn't figure into it at all. And I thought this is almost like the inverse of like with the moral Craig's moral argument when people say, "Oh, you're saying without God belief, you can't be a good person. So atheists are terrible people." It's like the inverse. It's like, oh, now on the other side, people are going, saying things like, "Oh, you're an anti-realist. You're a terrible person. How could you possibly believe that this is not?" It just seems like the exact is the like the kind of the inverse of the original misunderstanding of the moral argument, but on the other side. So that part I don't agree with it. I don't disagree with at all, right? That's what kind of basically it. Maybe you can. I've heard some people bring up some things like analogous to the normative entanglement, but when they do, I'm kind of two minds about it. So some people say like, well, what about like this kind of physical entanglement? Like people make judgments or say things about the external world. They're saying that you don't actually know what they're not saying they're external world realists. They're just saying what their phenomenological experience is. So et cetera, et cetera. Go. But that's not but even if that were true, that's not the point of kind of bringing in normative entanglement in the first place. Unless I guess we're going to say that because you're an external world anti-realist, you're some kind of crazy or bad person, which I've never heard that in my life. But that was the only thing I really had on the normative entanglement point. For the point of it, I think I agree. Right? I don't think you should confuse people's normative attitudes with their meta-ethical stances.
Okay.
Which they might or might not have, depending on who they are.
I think I shared, Lance, your sentiment that these surveys suck. Well, maybe that's too hard of a word. That these questions are so,
right, right.
And one question, it's just like, oh, you're a realist.
And see, that's the thing. Like, I didn't get time to go into any, and I wanted to go into any of the surveys and like read them and actually see their methods or anything because I got married. I got a full-time job, so I go. I'm gonna get up at 5 a.m. I get home at 5:30, and then I help with family stuff, and then I have certifications to do for work, either IT certifications. So I study that, and then I don't have time to do anything anymore, like with philosophy. So that's kind of going away a little bit because after this year I'm done with certifications, so that's going to be completely changed over back to like metaethics and moral psychology. But I just didn't get time to look at those. So with the moral psychology thing, I like one of the questions I think I had was the Pulitzer and Wright survey, for example, going across all the methodological paradigms and everything. I can't remember. I think you thought, Lance, you thought it was like the best one so far, like it was 2019 or something. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I can't remember what the problems were with it. I barely got to look at that. So maybe we could go over that one.
Yeah, we can. There's a lot to say there, though. So, okay. First, we should probably just, for people that haven't heard about normative entanglement, say what that is.
Yes.
So I have now generalized the concept of normative entanglement. I initially presented it purely as an issue in metaethics, but I actually think it does generalize. I'll give a couple examples too, because you mentioned I think it was like skepticism or something, but I actually do think it generalizes to some of those cases. So the general form of normative entanglement is whenever a person conflates a person's descriptive claims with, let me rephrase. Normative entanglement.
Dang it.
Now I got the pulse. Normative entanglement occurs whenever a person misleadingly implies that certain normative implications follow from a person's non-normative claims. That's when it occurs. So in metaethics, it occurs in a context like this. So you have this exchange between a moral realist and an anti-realist. And the realist might say to the anti-realist, hey, do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? And if this is phrased as a yes or no question. But the problem with that is if you say yes, you're saying yes implicitly, like you're agreeing there are these objective moral facts, and that among those facts, one of them is that it's wrong to torture babies. But if you say no, that actually puts you in one of three possible categories, and there's no way to clearly disambiguate it with just the no. So it's not appropriate as a yes-no question because there's an asymmetric division between what a yes indicates and what a no indicates. It's embedding two questions at once. And so a yes is yes to both, whereas a no is consistent with a yes to one and a no to the other. a no to the first and a yes to the second, or a no to both. That's just the way that conjunctions work. And so it's a misleading type of question, and yet I see it all the time. And it's like formally misleading. It is, in a certain sense, a type of complex question, which is like a fallacious way to pose a question. And yet moral realists routinely ask this question. Now, I'm not saying that the only moral realists do this to anti-realists, and the anti-realists never do this to realists, or that people don't do this in other contexts. This is just a prototypical context that I use to illustrate the problem. Now, it's not just that. I also use it because this has happened so frequently to me that I do take it personally and this has happened to me. Like, I'm just not just making it up, but people have routinely implied that if I don't answer questions about metaethics in the right way, that I have brain damage, that I'm a psychopath, that I'm evil, that I'm a monster. They will like literally imply I am evil because of how I answer an abstract philosophical question about like folk semantics. So if I think that the way humans use moral sentences expresses non-propositional content only, I'm evil. That has no implications for what I do or what I think or how I act. Mm-hmm. So why would that follow? It's ridiculous, and yet people have routinely done it in contexts where it's not abstract. There are real stakes. When you're having a public discussion online and someone says outright, you are an evil monster that's okay with doing the most horrendous things. I don't even want to describe the things people will say. That matters. That's not a nice thing to say about somebody. Now, when it's put in a context where it's so obviously ridiculous that it doesn't stick as an objection, then it doesn't stick. But it's not cool when you're having a philosophical discussion where you're supposed to be talking about abstract issues and your interlocutor is implying that you personally are an evil person. And a lot of realists are not careful about this. And I'm honestly, it not as a philosophical or intellectual matter, as a personal and social matter. I'm tired of it. I'm tired of people implying I'm evil because I don't agree with their metaphysics or their semantic thesis. It's ridiculous. So what happens with those no responses? So your no response options are, you could think there are no objective moral facts, but you do think it's wrong to do whatever the bad thing is. Let's go with stealing, just because I don't like the horrible graphic example. So, someone says, is stealing objectively wrong? And a person says, yes. Okay, they're a realist and they think it's wrong. If they say no, they could be a realist, but not think stealing is wrong. That's weird, but they could think that. They could be an anti-realist, but think it's wrong in some way consistent with anti-realism, or they could be an anti-realist and not think that it's wrong. Maybe they're an error theorist and that's what they think. Any one of those is a possibility. But what happened, for me, I would say, I don't think it's objectively wrong, but I do think it's wrong just in a way consistent with anti-realism. And yet what people will do is, just imagine the conversation. Someone says, do you think horrible thing is objectively wrong? And you say, no. People will think you're saying you're okay with it. And that doesn't follow. So the problem is when people leverage that no response to imply, or sometimes to explicitly insist that you have normative moral standards that are atrocious and horrible and awful, which is not entailed by saying no to that question, or that you personally have like repugnant attitudes, like you don't care about the issue as much as the realist does. And that again is not entailed. It's possible that you don't care very much, but you could flip it around. Someone could say, yeah, I do think it's like, just imagine the person says, yes, it's objectively wrong to do the terrible thing, but then they go on to say, but they don't care about it and they do it all the time. Right. That's atrocious, right? So like saying yes doesn't make you automatically a saint. You could be an awful person. A person could say, yes, I do think it's wrong to steal. And they're like, well, they're currently stealing. I think it's wrong, but I do it anyway. I'm evil. Ha ha. A person could do that. So your character and your attitude and how good of a person you are is not contingent on how you answer that question. And yet it's leveraged in that way in practical discourses to imply the anti-realist is evil. So
can I
don't like that
real quick? Just on that one note, or would it interrupt you too much?
Yeah, sure.
When I hear that, and I hear more realists say that's just not what my brain does. I'm going to be honest with what my brain's doing, because I kind of sympathize with what they're saying, just not when they say you're a bad person. That's not the way I would argue. It's kind of like me and Chris, we have a specific kind of way we explain that metaethically, good and bad and right and wrong. We think there's this one way, and it's kind of like kind of alone here with other moral realists are looking at us like, what are you doing? Are you going to revise all of moral language, or what's going on over there? But we have this one way. So if our way is like necessarily correct, which it seems to me that it is, and let's just say that you disagree with it, okay? and that you're I guess let's just say an anti-realist quietist. And so when that question is posed to you, um, we'll stick with stealing. Is stealing wrong? And then you say no, or no, it's a complex question. It's a complex question. But the fact that you're thinking that this is a complex question, maybe some moral realists look at you and they're like, "Guy, you can't even answer yes or no. Wow, this is kind of weird. I'm kind of suspecting something about your character right now. Are you okay? Are you like Hannibal Lecter going? What's going on in there? What's going on in my brain is this: you're a perfectly good person. You're fine. You're there's nothing wrong with you at all. Um, but what I think is going on, and it's something that maybe me and Chris are doing, if you're correct, if correct is the right word to use. I'm just going to use that just for simplicity's sake. Let's just say you're correct and we're wrong. We're not seeing something that you see. Maybe let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the answers in your blogs and your dissertation, your YouTube videos. If I really pay attention to it, I come over to your side and I see, oh, I see what you're saying. I see what's going on there. But I didn't see something before. It didn't mean I was stupid. It doesn't mean you're stupid. It doesn't. Ignorance kind of a strong word. I wouldn't say that. It's just something that's like a product of belief not being closed under entailment. That's the way my brain goes. So if let's just say our view, for the sake of argument, is true, right? Let's just and you're fine. You're a good person. We're as far as pragmatic effects, like the practicality of our moral behavior. We both give to charities. Let's just say we both give money to the guy on the road. We help out people. We would stop people from getting mugged. We do everything. We're behaviorally indiscernible. Our moral behavior is just identical. So according to our view, I guess, and I know you know where we're going. I'm just trying to spell it out right. You're fine. The reason why you're fine, and you don't see this, you don't see the entailment, is because you live in a world in which the acts in your behavior have this robust, real, metaphysical kind of foundation, giving it objective goodness or objective rightness in terms of commands and God's character and stuff like that. You don't see that. And that does not mean you're stupid. I would never say that. It doesn't mean you're ignorant. You just don't see, and it would come out in any other like philosophical conversation where one interlocutor is claiming to know something that the other guy doesn't. And so they have a philosophical conversation about it, and they present these reasons and arguments to show that, oh, look, this belief that you have or we have would imply this. You don't believe that, but we're trying to show you that if our view is true, then it implies this. And so if this is true, the only reason why you're able to have this robust moral life is because we live in a God world. And the analogy I use is this. It's another maybe entanglement situation. Before the scientific discovery of photons was made, everyone could light a room with a candle, right? Right. You know where I'm going already. So everyone knew what
I already had an example in my head, which is water. Like I don't need to know what H2O is to know that I'm drinking like water.
To know that you're drinking water. We're both getting nourished in the same way when we drink the clear liquid in the glass. Everything's fine. But in my mind, is that mine? Something's ringing. In my mind, though,
no, that's me. Sorry.
If the metaethics debate is anything like the physics of water or the chemistry of water or the physics of light, if photons didn't exist and if hydrogen and oxygen didn't exist, there would be no water and there would be no light, because light's constituted by photons and water's constituted by H2O. And then, according to me and Chris, our obligations are constituted by divine commands. Now, just the fact that you disagree with that, this is what I want to emphasize. You're fine. You're a good person. I love you. You're amazing. But on a metaethical level, it seems like there's a substantive conversation that we could have that's not rhetorical. I don't want to make it rhetorical, but just purely theoretical, I guess. and this on the same level as photons and H2O. So we could agree like on the practical, pragmatic effects. The water nourishes us. The flashlight finds my keys in the dark room. The solipsist can use a flashlight. You know, the external world anti-realist can use a flashlight. The solipsist can look both ways before they cross the street. All that stuff. The behavior can be indiscernible, but it seems like there's this asymmetry on a theoretical level that has real world effects if the metaphysics were false. If, of course, the conditional is true. That's going to be the question. But I'm just saying, if me and Chris are right, all it would imply is that you're not seeing like the entailment of a belief. And it's like on the same level as any other philosophical discussion where you see something that we don't or something. And there's no need to get rhetorical or anything. I know you wouldn't with us, and it's bad manners to do that and all that stuff. But that to my brain, that seems like that's all that's going on. And what do you think of that?
That sometimes is going on, and hopefully many conversations. It's not like realists and anti-realists don't have productive discussions. Like you could look at Peter Railton and Don Loeb's discussion on metaethics. I think, and I don't get that impression that anybody's trying to leverage anybody to make them look bad there. So these conversations happen all the time. It's probably the majority of conversations, especially among professional philosophers. But you will see an enormous amount of it of apologists arguing with atheists, atheists arguing with other atheists, people having random discussions on the internet, but also professional philosophers will do this. They'll imply that it's like, so for instance, here's a thing that professional philosophers will routinely do. Yeah. They will describe relativism. They will only mention agent relativism. And then they'll say, if you're a relativist, you have to think that if members of another culture do horrible things, it's okay for them to do horrible things. Yeah. That's not an entailment of relativism. That's an entailment specifically of agent cultural relativism. It's not an entailment of any type of appraiser relativism. So why are they framing it that way? Because if I point this out to them, they'll say, oh, well, yeah, sure. Okay, that's just agent relativism, but I'm simplifying things, or I'm not going to I can't get into too much detail. Yeah. You don't want to simplify to the point of being misleading. And that is misleading. Yes. I've seen professional philosophers say that what some of them will describe what sounds like bullying to me, like the ones that will say, and I think Craig gives an example like this. Student says they're a relativist, and then they're like, it sounds apocryphal. I don't know if this has ever really happened. They give him an F on a paper, and then when the student objects, they're like, well, you're a relativist. You have to be okay with it. That is not an entailment of relativism. It's not.
Craig would never
because
do
if
that.
You're an appraiser relativist, the wrongness of their actions is conditional on your appraisal, not their standards. Yes. So it's just a fundamental misunderstanding of the conceptual possibilities available to different types of relativists. So, how is it that they have a PhD and wrote their dissertation on metaethics, and they don't draw basic distinctions in the types of positions available to relativists? They pick the most indefensible and ridiculous type of relativism, and then they present that as if that they'll just say relativism. That's not accurate. Aren't philosophers supposed to be all about their categories and distinctions and precision, especially analytic philosophers? And yet suddenly they have to simplify things. No, look, I'm just going to say, I think that they don't like relativism, and they're motivated to misrepresent and straw man it and make it seem like relativists are stupid or evil, so that they could quickly dismiss the view and move on to their preferred views. That's not doing good philosophy. It's ridiculous. And so they do this kind of thing all the time. Again, it's professionals do this, not just lay people. So that is part of what animates me about it. One, I don't like when people depict proponents of my view as stupid or evil. And two, I don't like it when professionals that ought to know better, or in some cases I suspect do know better, do it anyway. That is not cool. So there is all that bad behavior. Fortunately, most of the philosophers, most of the time, don't do that. So you could set that aside. It's not like it's impossible to have non-rhetorical discussions. We're having one right now. But it is a problem. And the reason it's a problem is because it's ubiquitous. It's in your face all the time. And I think that it is so endemic to public discussion about metaethics to depict anti-realists as stupid or evil, that it's a serious impediment to having a clear discussion about the issue. When one side of a dispute is consistently depicted as horrible monsters or self-deluded morons for unjust, like, look, there could be a dispute where one side of the dispute are horrible monsters. Then fine, I'm fine with that. If one side of the dispute is like, we should be cannibals, like, then I'm against that. But that's not what anti-realists are doing.
I was going to say, think about the names that me and Chris are called for adhering to divine command theory. There's so many different ways to rhetorically, really? So if God told you to go rape someone, wait, can I say that? Steal, I'll say steal. Yeah, keep going to the bad one. steal. You'd be okay with stealing? It's like, oh no, that's not what we. So, like, I sympathize with your like sociological position. Like, you see yourself as a minority, and then because there's more realists, and then me and Chris see ourselves as a minority too, because we look at the taxonomy of realisms, and we're like, that's not even morality. And every time we see our position represented in their literature on their YouTube videos, like even with Eric Sampson, he described divine command theory, and I'm sitting there like, I don't believe that. Does anybody represent this view right? And we're like all alone. We feel just as kind of isolated when
Yeah,
we're
try having that attitude
yeah.
too with like students. Like,
Huh?
so like, yeah, I teach at IU East. Like, try calling the students evil, horrible monsters. Look, the number of students that come in, it's usually a number of relativists and sometimes more realists. And I have a few more nihilists every once in a while, right? I don't go on their papers when they submit their midterms and say, hey, you're a horrible, terrible person. I wouldn't have a job, and it's not correct. I mean, it's one thing if they wanted to say, "Hey,"
You
one
get away
thing
with
to
it.
be like, "Hey, your view is horrible" or something. It's just this is nasty. Then it's one thing to do that, and even that you have to really be careful because a lot of people identify with their views, right? So if you say your view is terrible, horrible, etc., and then they say, "Oh wow, he's attacking me as horrible," I mean, you have to communicate clearly. I mean, I think there are different levels of it, and actually saying this now kind of reminds me of when I was doing the research into like admoral psychology and defining command theory and all that. Most people talking about that were more realists. They were philosophers getting into moral psychology, and usually the people who they usually say things like, or at least suggest that being a moral realist is just kind of literally like a feature of being human, right? And so they'll say that, and then what will happen is like, okay, well, what people aren't like this? Psychopaths, people with strong dementia, people with rational, affective, or developmental disorders. And then it goes to that, and then you see someone in the real world, and like, oh my gosh, you're not a moral realist, you're a insert X, right? So that just kind of came to my mind.
Can I give you an actual example of this?
Oh yeah, Lance, of course.
Yeah, I'm going to show you this. So this is, and I'll link it in the comments. So one of the things that has been happening more recently is people will say, well, when does this occur? How does this occur? Now, one of the things I haven't done is kept a big catalog, and I really wish I did this so that I could just say, here are 712 instances in which a person has used normative entanglement. Shut up and leave me alone. Because, one of the things that happens when I say that philosophers will make claims about sentences having meanings independent of how people use the sentences is people say, no, they don't. I sometimes feel like people are gaslighting me on what philosophers are doing. Cause I'm like, look, so one of the things I've said, for instance, and I do this in the dissertation, is some people have said it is not the case that 20th century analytic philosophers were attempting to describe how people actually speak in real world circumstances. And so I have to give them quotes from those philosophers, like Mackey saying, I am trying to describe how people speak. Like he says something like the person on the public bus. I'm trying to capture what that person is trying to say.
Yes.
And then I've given those quotes to people. They go, he's not trying to say that this is a theory about what people in public are trying to say. I'm like, it literally says, this is a theory about what people in public are trying to say. And they're like, no, it's not. It's not what he means. So he doesn't mean what he's saying. What? So of course they could say, well, no. It might look like he's saying that, but he's really intending to say something else. And on your view, that's technically possible.
Right.
I concede it's technically possible that when Mackey says he's trying to describe what people on the bus are trying to say, he doesn't necessarily mean what I think that means. But I mean, and then I could just give people quote after quote after quote, and then they'll just say, no, that's not what they mean. Okay. I don't know what to do with people.
Not to just cut you, I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry. I just looked up an hour and 24 minutes in. Chronos is so mean. Very, very mean God. Did you want to take, because we agreed we're going to do just separate parts. So before it gets too long, do you want to do the question thing from your audience at all? Or
they're not giving us questions. So
they're not giving us questions at all.
You want to wrap up after 2 hours? Is that cool?
I'm okay for probably the next hour and 15 minutes. So, I mean, so it's up to
I could do a bit longer. I'm cool with it. So, I mean, we could always chop things up and post them. So I'm fine with spending more time. Yeah. I wanted to give you this quote because I wrote a blog post about this quote. I haven't got a response to it, but this is a quote from David Freeman. I will put it in the comments, but let me read the quote. He says this: it is only a slight exaggeration to say that almost everyone believes in moral realism, and almost everyone, at least in the circles I usually move in, denies believing in it. Everyone, with the possible exception of psychopaths, feels that some things, stealing from a friend who trusts you, for example, are wrong, not just illegal or imprudent, but wrong. So right there, you have someone basically implying, look, there are people, like everyone believes moral realism pretty much. There's people that deny it. And then the implication seems to be, look, people that actually didn't believe moral realism would be psychopaths. And I think the implication is these people that are denying it, they're actually moral realists. They're just confused about what their own commitments and beliefs are. So they're not really psychopaths. It's just the only way you could really be an anti-realist is a psychopath. And that's one thing I wanted to address about the normative entanglement stuff, which is that some people will say, look, I don't actually think you're evil or psychopathic or a monster. I think you would have to be to genuinely be an anti-realist. So you must not be an anti-realist. And I also find that to be pretty objectionable, because I'm having someone basically say, look, you identify in a particular way with this philosophical view. You're very confident about it. You're passionate about your philosophical worldview, but you're so confused that you act and live your life in a way fundamentally inconsistent with some of your central beliefs, values, and attitudes about the world. I find that pretty objectionable. It could be true. I have to concede that could be true. But I'm not a big fan of people implying that the only way for my view to be true would be if I was a psychopath. I'm not a psychopath, therefore the view is not true. And so I'm living inconsistently because, in other words, I'm given this dilemma. Either I'm a psychopath or I'm confused, like just remarkably confused about my own worldview. And like, it could be true, conditional on someone else's view being true, that my view is false, but that's trivially true. Of course, conditional on me being wrong, I'm wrong. But like, that's a pretty true. Conditional on you being wrong, you're wrong. Like, what kind of trivial point is that to make? But it would be weird for me to say something like this. Since Lance Bush's pragmatist, quietist, anti-realist view is correct, when you go around making moral decisions, you're actually conceptually confused and living hypocritically and inconsistently, because really you're doing what I say you're doing, not what you take yourself to be doing. I think if I was really like aggressively insisting that you are hypocritical and self-deluded, I don't think you would be a big fan of it. And yet people will say this about me. You're not saying that, but that's basically the setup that a lot of realists will give to anti-realists. And I don't think they appreciate it. I have a name for this. I call it the halfway fallacy. And the halfway fallacy is a sort of partial failure of imagination. It's like the realist sometimes will seem to think, okay, you can reject realism, but because realist ways of thinking about things are the only conceptually satisfying and appropriate ways of thinking about it, you're rejecting the correct way. And so really you're just living this sort of, you've got one foot outside of my view, and that just causes all these problems, but the other foot is stuck in my view. So you are saddled with the problems I think you're saddled with. But what I think a lot of people don't appreciate is that the person can take both steps to be completely outside their view. And a lot of times it's just a total failure of imagination. I'll give one example. When anti-realists like myself respond to companions to guilt arguments, these views basically say, look, if you're going to deny moral realism, you have to deny epistemic realism, but there are these objective epistemic facts. So you're not going to be able to deny both. You got to accept both or neither. But I reject both. And critics will say that's self-defeating. If you reject epistemic realism, then you're denying that you have any stance-independent epistemic reasons to reject epistemic realism. So that's self-defeat. Okay, well, I both reject that there are stance-independent epistemic facts, and I reject that the only success conditions for being justified in holding a belief are if you have stance-independent epistemic norms that entail that you ought to hold the view. I reject both the position and the notion that the position is required for success, like epistemic success. And yet the critics will say, no, but you got to have that. That's part of what I'm rejecting. That's silly. It's weird. It's like they can't imagine that I reject the whole view and not just part of it. And this happens on all ends all the time. I said I was going to give a couple other examples of normative entanglement. So a couple, and these are really easy to mention. Sometimes if someone says, I don't believe in free will, someone will say, oh, so you think we should just let everybody out of prison and we shouldn't do anything if someone just runs around hurting people? That's not an implication of rejecting free will. Another one, sometimes people will say this about people who deny phenomenal consciousness, like Keith Frankish or Dan Dennett. They'll say, oh, you don't even believe that people have subjective experiences, so you don't even think that people are capable of happiness or suffering. It wouldn't matter to you if someone set you on fire. And that's ridiculous, because what they're doing is they're not just rejecting that we have phenomenal consciousness, they have an alternative view about what consciousness actually is.
Yes.
And it's the same thing with a person that denies free will. They might say, look, we don't have desert-based moral responsibility, but there are pragmatic or practical reasons for why it's useful or it makes sense or we're justified on a different set of moral principles in punishing people or imprisoning people or trying to rehabilitate people. They have an alternative framework that it's like, if I deny part of your view, I'm not left with nothing. I'm left with a potential alternative framework. It's one thing that happens when when sometimes when people encounter atheists will say, so you believe in nothing? And I've always just found that really weird. Like, I don't believe in what you believe, so therefore I don't believe in anything. Why would that follow? I believe in the things I believe in. And so I'm not, sorry, I don't mean to depict theists as always asking or making bad assumptions about non-theists. You see common things on both sides. I could say a million things
like that all the time.
I could say a million things about how atheists will say, like, morality, you just need evolution to explain that. And then they can't explain what natural selection is. They have no idea about what the literature on it says. So you get all these atheists that treat science like this pile of scripture that they don't even read. So, like, I have problems on both sides of this. But anyway, I said a lot there. So
yeah.
No,
that free will entanglement. That when they say you just think we should let people out of prison because you set anybody on fire, etc. Like, that's not even true on their, like, usually probably libertarians will be saying this, right? And it's not even true on their view. Usually they'll say there are no oughts then, right? If free will, because free will, more responsibility requires free will. You don't have free will, you don't have more responsibility. There's no shoulds then. What's the should? Where's the should? Anyway, yeah, that's just a nitpick. That isn't. Yeah, I agree though.
I did see those. Yeah, I just looked at that blog.
Huh?
Blog where you're listing these examples of normative entanglement.
Yeah,
we saw that Facebook post. Give me some examples here of the normative entanglement.
Yeah. I've been asking people, and I'm starting to archive examples, and I want them to go out because they're everywhere. So philosophers just consistently try to leverage, and there's a general feature of the way that they do it. There's basically, in ordinary language, there's all this pragmatics of what we're saying. There's connotations, there's implications of what we mean.
Yes.
And when philosophers will take their syllogisms and their sentences, they extract them from the everyday contexts, and they reconstrue them using exactly the same words in a philosophical context, where it's clear from the context that certain philosophical presuppositions are baked into the meaning of the sentences, but they're not necessarily baked into the meaning of the sentences in the everyday context. Mm-hmm. And then they'll say, hey, what do you think about this sentence? And by the way, I'm baking this meaning into it. Do you reject the sentence? And then if you say yes, they'll go, so you're rejecting it in the everyday context too. And that's just silly. Like, if I just stipulated, hey, by it's wrong to hurt people for fun, I mean the anti-realist, like an emotivist view. Do you accept that do you endorse the sentence? It's wrong to hurt people for fun. Mm-hmm. If you're a realist, the answer is going to be no, because you don't endorse the emotivist. But imagine if I then said, oh, wow, so you don't think it's wrong to hurt people just for fun? Oh my gosh. That's ridiculous. Right. It's sliding and equivocating between the technical meaning of what is meant by that sentence in that conversation and its meaning in everyday discourse. So in that conversation, I'm actually asking a question like this. Do you think the sentence, it's wrong to hurt people just for fun, exclusively expresses non-propositional attitudes such as people's emotions? And then the answer to that is no, and that doesn't carry any horrible implications. But if I just ask, do you endorse that sentence, by the way, with a specifically emotivist reading, yes or no, and then you say no, there's something totally inappropriate about me taking that sentence and then presenting it as if it were a sentence in an everyday conversation, where we understand that if you said, no, I don't think it's wrong to hurt people just for fun, that you actually sound like a psychopath. And so what philosophers are doing is leveraging that equivocation between the everyday context and the philosophical context, and they slide between the two to try to consistently depict anybody that disagrees with them as stupid or evil. And it's really ridiculous. And the reason it's ridiculous is because it's very obvious they're doing this. It should be obvious to them, and they keep doing it anyway. And there just isn't a philosophical literature pointing this problem out and chastising philosophers appropriately for basically like language abuse. I mean, this is language abuse. This is just misusing language for rhetorical purposes. And it's analytic philosophers doing it. And they're doing it in a way where it's like analytic philosophy actually made them way better at doing it than people without training in analytic philosophy. So analytic philosophy is unironically actually endowing analytic philosophers with an extraordinary capacity for sophistry. And they exploit it to the hilt all the time. And no one's acknowledging or appreciating this or doing anything about it.
I tend to think that, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, two things. I got about 7 minutes for a hard stop since I'm still at work and I'm using my lunch to do this.
Retire first.
Yeah, I got 7. Oh, I got 6 minutes. All right. Okay. So I actually blame bad theories of reference on a lot of this too. People tend to think that somehow words or statements by themselves or propositions like just by themselves mean something. Like that the words that they're somehow intrinsically intentional, right? Rather than and that's like half of the views. The other half is that you can't determine the meaning of a term or a sentence or proposition without when someone utters a statement, you have to know their intentions, right? When they're uttering the statement, otherwise you don't know what the sentence means, right? And so if you go for the former though, the kind of analytic tradition, someone will say, oh, so, okay, you don't think that stealing is wrong then, because these words have meaning regardless of your intentions. And so you must be saying that it's not wrong to steal. Instead of what I think is true, the latter, which is you have to know their intentions before you can say something like that.
Yeah, I exactly agree with that. And that's why I think, and this is why I'm quick to emphasize that the problems are problems with philosophers having misconceptions about how language works. They have wrong theories or weird views about theories of reference. They really hate the Wittgensteinian approach, the language is use approaches, and I think they're wrong. I think this is a case where I'm just happy to say they are wrong, and they need to get it together and get on board with a better understanding of how language works. And that's very much that Wittgenstein approach is misunderstandings about language are at the root of so many philosophical problems, or I would say pseudo problems.
Yeah, no kidding.
No, I do disagree.
That was a huge problem in abstract object talk with Quine's indispensability argument for abstracta. That's just one of the biggest examples possible. It leads people to actually think that there are an infinite number of new objects out there. For example, it's pretty powerful.
And Quine's called a pragmatist too in some contexts. He's like a strand of pragmatism off the big three.
Right. Because he also talked about we have to believe in these things to get our use out of them in language, and they have to exist because if not, then our best scientific theories aren't true. Right, and so it's kind of a pragmatic approach. We need to be pragmatists about science, and they can't be true in some important sense without the existence of these things. So therefore, they must exist, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. All right, Chris, go talk to your boss and just come.
I got 4 minutes. You're not kicking me out yet.
Well,
where do we want to take things? I feel like we've opened a dozen conversational threads. So,
yeah, you can talk, Chris, until you got to go. Since you got to go soon, you can have the floor.
About what? I don't know where to go. All right.
Oh, I got it.
If you got somewhere, go ahead, and I'll chime in the 3 minutes I have. If I have something, and
I'm just being honest with where my brain is. Like for example, Lance just said they're wrong about Wittgenstein. They're about the Wittgensteinian approach, the pragmatist approach to language and stuff like that. My brain's like, I agree with Lance. I do think we do need to not pluck sentences out from forms of life and give it some kind of a completely I don't know how to say it, just to try to express that plucked sentence in some kind of formal language so that its meaning is completely transparent to any inquirer, any moral inquirer. I'll say it like that. But I'm having trouble. I see what the point is. I'm just having trouble excluding the analytics, because I feel like the analytics are serving a purpose in that if we just let the normal people talk and the analytic, because like analytic philosophers are people too, of course, and then they hear the way people talk, and all I'm seeing is what's happening is that they're seizing upon a particular, or what they take to be a particular use of what they're hearing in an everyday context and formalizing that. And it seems like it's not in principle impossible to do that with every use. So when I hear like Wittgenstein say the meaning of a word is its use in the language, that's fine. But then if I just, okay, if I go to that one particular usage, I can formalize that and unpack exactly what that means using analytic tools. And then we can unpack like what's going on in terms of the sentence's meaning or the sentence's truth conditions or something like that. Like I don't see the two as in, I see them in conflict if they're like totalizing projects or something where they exclude each other. But if there seems to be some kind of complementary stuff going on there,
Yeah,
and then once
that's
I
true.
do that, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's true. You could say, if you mean this, or when a person is communicating
That's
this, these
exactly what I was going to
philosophical
say. Like
implications follow.
with the survey. Yeah, with the survey questions, if I could be right there while they're asking the question and be like, okay, you know, if you're answering this, the survey guy is going to think you're a moral realist. Okay, well, what's that? Like these answers got to be thicker and more diachronic, like over time. Like somebody's got to be right there. And then the other thing to avoid rhetoric on my end is when I unpack what moral realism is, maybe I don't want to say things like, by the way, if you're a moral realist, you're going to be ontologically committed to these abstract, non-spatiotemporal moral properties that are going to be, satisfying the truth conditions for the moral propositions that you're going to use when you say the ceiling's wrong. Or maybe we could say something like, this won't be perfect, but we could like finesse it over time or something. All the moral realist is meaning is, let's just say that everybody on the planet thought that stealing was correct. Okay, everybody. Would it still be wrong? And the moral realist would say yes. Something like that. That's getting closer. We're not talking about properties right now. We're not talking about weird abstracta. We're not talking about anything where the guy's going to be like, no, I don't mean that, and it's going to sway him away from a moral realism answer. So when me and Chris we're looking over these surveys, we're like, man, we wish we were right there so we could just ask them. Is when we're talking about the more macabre cases, like the cases I won't say because they're kind of unsavory. Me and our intuitions, me and Chris's intuitions are, if we were right there and we're like, what the question's asking, and not to guide it. I'm not trying to be rhetorical. I'm really not. But what the realist is trying to say is, if everybody thought this, would it still be wrong? And if you answer yes, you're getting closer to what the realist is trying to say. Because it seems like all the other options are going to make it stance dependent. They're going to make it dependent on desires or goals or things like that, and what the person cares about bringing about in accordance with the desires and all that stuff. So maybe if you unpack it like that, it'd be approximating the realist position more, and the surveys could be more accurate.
Yeah, that gets a little bit into counterfactual normativity as well. But that's for another video. But yeah, I have got
Drop
to
the
go.
movie trailer right in our lap.
My life is over. All right. It was good talking to you, Lance.
We cut it short if Chris has got to go, though.
Really good time.
Because I want you to be a part of the conversation. We should just want to end it here. And
no, I'm fine. Like I have no problem with this. Chime in when I have thoughts. Yeah,
okay.
or if it's in metaethics specifically, I could talk forever on that too. So
no, I mean the live stream. We should probably just cut it short because I want you to be a part of the discussion.
Yeah, it's up to you. Whichever is fine. Yeah.
Is that all right, Lance? Since we're already going 44 minutes, we'll probably cut it there. But okay, do you want to respond to what I said, and you have the last word in the video, and we'll
yeah, I mean, so I think there's so many things to talk about here. There are actually techniques in psychology. There's cognitive interviewing. You could just do a semi-structured interview. There's qualitative research. And a big part of what I did in the dissertation is I literally just took people answering these survey questions and said, why? Why did you answer the question this way? What are you thinking? Awesome. Or what do you take your response to mean? Or I give them someone else's response and said, what do you think this? So I'm doing kind of meta research. And that's something that we could talk about because the results of that are super duper interesting. At least I think so. I did it. So I think it's cool. But the implications are really fascinating too, I think.
Yes. Lance, you're the man. Thank you so much for coming on. This is awesome. When you get to the end of the videos, you really you see that this is impossible. This is impossible to talk about everything to do with this issue. It's so complicated.
This is why I said this needs to be multi-part.
Let's make it indefinite. Let's make it indefinite. Why not? But I'll be in touch with you on Discord too to set up part 2, 3,
Sounds
4,
good.
and all that stuff. But to the audience, it's the most audience we've ever had. So we want to thank Lance for all those people that joined into the stream. But take care and God bless.